Welcome to Mystery Maven. Today we have Meet the Tiger. Meet the Tiger is an action-adventure novel written by Leslie Charteris. In England it was first published by Ward Lock in September 1928. In the United States it was first published by Doubleday's The Crime Club imprint in March 1929 with the variant title Meet the Tiger. Meet the Tiger by Leslie Charteris. The First Saint Novel. Chapter 1. The Pillbox. Bacum is a village on the North Devon coast that is so isolated from civilization that even at the height of the summer holiday season it is neglected by the rush of lean and plump, tall and short, papas, mammas and infants. Consequently, there was some sort of excuse for a man who had taken up his dwelling there falling into the monotony of regular habits. Even for a man who had only lived there for 3 days, even, let the worst be known, for a man so unconventional as Simon Templar. It was not so very long after Simon Templar had settled down in Bacum that peacefully sedate village became most unsettled, and things began to happen there that shocked and flabbergasted its peacefully sedate inhabitants, as will be related. But at first, Simon Templar found Bacum as dull as it had been for the last 600 years. Simon Templar. In some parts of the world he was quite well known, from his initials, as the Santee, was a man of 27, tall, dark, keen-faced, deeply tanned, blue-eyed. That is a rough description. It was not long before Bacum had observed him more closely and woven mysterious legends about him. Bacum did that within the first 2 days of his arrival, and it must be admitted that he had given some grounds for speculation. The house he lived in, it may perhaps be dignified with the title of house, since a gang of workmen from Ilfracombe had worked without rest for 36 hours to make it habitable, had been built during the war as a coast defence station, at a time when the War Office were vaguely alarmed by rumours of a projected invasion at some unlikely point. Possibly because they thought Bacum was the last point any enemy strategist would expect them to expect an invasion at, the War Office had erected a kind of pillbox on the tor above the village. The work had been efficiently carried out, and a small garrison had been installed, but apparently the War Office had been cleverer than the German tacticians, for no attempt was made to land an army at Bacum. In 1918, the garrison and the guns had been removed, and the miniature concrete fortress had been abandoned to the games of the local children until Simon Templar, by some means known only to himself, had discovered that the pillbox and the quarter of a square mile of land in which it stood was still the property of the War Office, and in some secret way had managed to persuade the said War Office to sell him the freehold for £25. In this curious home the saint had installed himself, together with a retainer who went by the name of Horace, and the saint had been so overcome with the dullness of Bacum that within 3 days he was the victim of routine. At 9 a.m. on this third day, the saint had a rooted objection to early rising. The man who went by the name of Horace entered his master's bedroom bearing a cup of tea and mug of hot water. "Nice morning, sir," said Horace, and retired. Horace had remarked on the niceness of the morning for the last 8 years, and he had never allowed the weather to change his pleasant custom. The saint yawned, stretched himself like a cat, and saw with half-closed eyes that a stream of sunlight was pouring in through the embrasure, which did duty for a window. The optimism of Horace being justified, Simon Templar sighed, stretched himself again, and after a moment's indecision leapt out of bed. He shaved rapidly, sipping his tea in between whiles, and then pulled on a bathing costume and went out into the sun, picking up a length of rope on his way out. He skipped energetically on the grass outside for 15 minutes. Then he shadowboxed for 5 minutes. Then he grabbed a towel, knotted it loosely round his neck, sprinted the couple of dozen yards that lay between the pillbox and the edge of the cliff, and coolly swung himself over the edge. 150-foot drop lay beneath him, but handholds were plentiful, and he descended to the beach as nonchalantly as he would have descended a flight of stairs. The water was rippling calm. He covered a quarter of a mile at racing speed, turned on his back and paddled lazily shorewards, finishing the last 100 yards like a champion. Then he lay at the edge of the surf, basking in the strengthening sun. All these things he had done as regularly on the 2 previous mornings, and he was languidly pondering the deadliness of regular habits when the thing happened that proved to him quite conclusively that regular habits could be more literally deadly than he had allowed for. "Phew, wook!" Something sang past his ear, and the pebble at which he had been staring in an absent-minded sort of way leapt sideways, and was left with a silvery streak scored across it, while the thing that had sang changed its note and went whining seawards. "Bad luck, sonny," murmured the saint mildly. "Only a couple of inches out." But he was on his feet before the sound of the shot had reached him. He was on one of the arms of the bay, which was roughly semicircular. The village was in the centre of the arc. A quick calculation told him that the bullet had come from some point on the cliff between the pillbox and the village, but he could see nothing on the skyline. A moment later, a frantic silhouette appeared at the top of the tor, and the voice of Oros hailed down an anxious query. The saint waved his towel in response and, making for the foot of the cliff, began to climb up again. He accomplished the difficult ascent with no apparent effort, quite unperturbed by the thought that the unknown sniper might essay a second round. And presently the saint stood on the grass above, hands on hips, gazing keenly down the slope towards the spot where the bullet had seemed to come from. A quarter of a mile away was a broad clump of low bushes. Beyond the copse, he knew, was a cart track leading down to the village. The saint shrugged and turned to Oris, who had been fuming and fidgeting around him. "The tiger knows his stuff," remarked Simon Templar with a kind of admiration. "Like a greenhorn," spluttered Oris. "Like a namakor. What did ya expect? And just what you observed? And I hope it learns ya. You ain't hurt, sir, are ye?" added Oris, succumbing to human sympathy. "No, but near enough," said the saint. Oris flung out his arms. "Pity you didn't plug you one, just to make you more careful next time." "I'd have been grateful to him. And if I ever lay my hands on the swine is for it," concluded Oris somewhat illogically, and strutted back to the pillbox. Oris, as a sergeant of marines, had received a German bullet in his right hip at Zeebrugge, and had walked with a lopsided strut ever since. "Breakfast in half a minute," Oris flung over his shoulder. The saint strolled after him at a leisurely pace, and returned to his bedroom whistling. Nevertheless, Oris, entering the sitting-room with a tray precisely half a minute later, found the saint stretched out in an armchair. The saint's hair was impeccably brushed, and he was fully dressed, according to the saint's ideas of full dress in shoes, socks, a dilapidated pair of grey flannel trousers, and a snowy silk tennis shirt. Oris snorted, and the saint smiled. "Oris," said the saint conversationally, lifting the cover from a plate of bacon and eggs, "one gathers that things are just about to hum." Responded Oris. "About to, if you prefer it," said the saint equably. "The point is that the orchestra are in their places. The noises off have hitched up their hosiery, the conductor has unkempt his hair, the seconds are getting out of the ring, the guard is blowing his whistle, the skipper has rung down for full steam ahead, The coffee's getting cold," said Oris. The saint buttered a triangle of toast. "How unsympathetic you are, Oris," he complained. "Well, if my flights of metaphor fail to impress you, let us put it like this. We're off." Agreed Oris, and returned to the improvised kitchen. Simon finished his meal and returned to the armchair, from which he had a view of the cliff and the sea beyond. He skimmed through the previous day's paper. Bacum was at least 24 hours behind the rest of England, and then smoked a meditative cigarette. At length he rose, fetched and pulled on a well-worn tweed coat, picked up an unwieldy walking stick, and went to the curtained breach in the fortifications which was used for a front door. "Oris." "Sir," answered Oris, appearing at the threshold of the kitchen. "I'm going to have a look round. I'll be back for lunch." "Aye, aye, sir. Sir." The saint was turning away, and he stopped. Oris fumbled under his apron and produced a fearsome weapon, a revolver of pre-war make and enormous calibre, which he offered to his master. "It ain't much to look at," said Oris, stroking the barrel lovingly, "and I wouldn't use it for fancy shooting, but it'll make a bigger hole in a man than any of those pretty automatics." "Thanks," grinned the saint, "but it makes too much noise. I prefer Anna." Said Oris. Oris could put any shade of meaning into that simple monosyllable, and on this occasion there was no doubt about the precise shade of meaning he intended to convey. The saint was studying a slim blade which he had taken from a sheath strapped to his forearm, hidden under his sleeve. The knife was about 6 inches long in the blade, which was leaf-shaped and slightly curved. The haft was scarcely 3 inches long, of beautifully carved ivory. The hole was so perfectly balanced that it seemed to take life from the hand that held it, and its edge was so keen that a man could have shaved with it. The saint spun the sliver of steel high in the air and caught it adroitly by the hilt as it fell back, and in the same movement he returned it to its sheath with such speed that the knife seemed to vanish even as he touched it. "Don't you be rude about Anna," said the saint, wagging a reproving forefinger. "She'd take a man's thumb off before the gun was half out of his pocket." And he went striding down the hill towards the village, leaving Orris to pessimistic disgust. It was early summer and pleasantly warm, a fact which made the saint's selection of the pillbox for a home less absurd than it would have seemed in winter. There was another reason for his choice, besides a desire for quantities of fresh air and the simple life, as will be seen. The saint whistled as he walked, swinging his heavy stick, but his eyes never relaxed their vigilant study of every scrap of cover that might hide another sniper. He walked boldly down to the bushes which he had suspected that morning and spent some time in a minute search for incriminating evidence, but there had been no rain for days, and even his practised eye could make little of the spoor he found. Near the edge of the cliff he caught a golden gleam under a tuft of grass, and found a cartridge case. 315 Mauser, commented the saint. "Naughty! Naughty!" He dropped the shell into his pocket and studied the ground closely, but the indistinct impressions gave him no clue to the size or shape of the unknown, and at last he resumed his thoughtful progress towards the village. Bacum, which is really no more than a fishing village, lies barely above sea level, but on either side the red cliffs rise away from the harbour and the hills rise behind, so that Bacum lies in a hollow opening on the Bristol Channel. Facing seawards from the harbour, the pillbox would have been seen crowning the Tor on the right, the only building to the east for some 10 miles. The Tor on the left was some 50 feet lower, and was dotted with half a dozen red brick and grey stone houses belonging to the aristocracy. The saint, via Horace, who had drunk beer in the public-house by the quay to some advantage, already knew the names and habits of this oligarchy. The richest member was one Hans Bloem, a boer of about 50, who was also reputed to be the meanest man in Devonshire. Bloem frequently had a nephew staying with him, who was as popular as his uncle was. Unpopular, the nephew was Algernon de Breton-Lomas Coper, wore a monocle, was one of the lads, and highly esteemed locally for a very pleasant ass. The best people were represented by Sir Michael Lapping, a retired judge, the proletariat by Sir John Bittle, a retired wholesale grocer. There was a manor, but it had no lord, for it had passed to a gaunt, grim, masculine lady, Miss Agatha Girton, who lived there unhonoured and unloved, with her ward, whom the village honoured and loved without exception. For the rest, there were 2 Indian civil servants who, under the prosaic names of Smith and Shaw, survived on their pensions in a tiny bungalow, and a Dr. Khan. A very dull and ordinary bunch, reflected Simon Templar, as he stood at the top of the village street pondering his next move. Except, perhaps, the ward. Is she the loverly heroine of this blinking adventure? This hopeful thought directed his steps towards the Blue Moon, which was at the same time Bacum's club and pub. But the saint did not reach the Blue Moon that morning, because as he passed the shop which supplied all the village requirements, from shoes to ships and sealing wax, a girl came out. "I'm so sorry," said the saint, steadying her with one arm. He retrieved the parcel which the collision had knocked out of her hand, and in returning it to her he had the chance of observing her face more closely. He could find no flaw there, and she had the most delightful of smiles. Her head barely topped his shoulder. "You must be the ward," said Simon. "Miss Pat, the village doesn't give you a surname." She nodded. "Patricia Home," she said. "And you must be the mystery man." "Not really. Am I that already?" said the saint with interest, and she saw at once that the desire to hide his light under a bushel was not one of his failings. It is always a question whether the man inspires the nickname, or the nickname inspires the man. When a man is known to his familiars as Beau or Rabbit, there is little difficulty in supplying the answer, but a man who is called Song may be either a lion or a lamb. It is doubtful whether Simon Templar would have been as proud of his title as he was if he had not found that it provided him with a ready-made, effective and useful pose, for the sant was pleasantly egotistical. "There are the most weird and wonderful rumours," said the girl, and the saint looked milder than ever. "You must tell me," he said. He had fallen into step beside her, and they were walking up the rough road that led to the houses on the West Tor. "I'm afraid we've been very inhospitable," she said frankly. "You see, you set up house in the pillbox, and that left everybody wondering whether you were possible or impossible. Bacum society is awfully exclusive." "I'm flattered," said the saint. "Accordingly, after seeing you home, I shall return to the pillbox and sit down to consider whether Bacum society is possible or impossible." She laughed. "You're a most refreshing relief," she told him. "Bacum is full of inferiority complexes." "Fortunately," remarked Simon gently, "I don't wear hats." Presently she said, "What brings you to this benighted spot?" "A craving for excitement and adventure," answered the saint promptly, reinforced by an ambition to be horribly wealthy. She looked at him with a quick frown, but his face confirmed the innocence of sarcasm which had given a surprising twist to his words. "I shouldn't have thought anyone would have come here for that," she said. "On the contrary," said the saint genially, "I should have no hesitation in recommending this particular spot to any qualified adventurer as one of the few places left in England where battle, murder, and sudden death may be quite commonplace events. I've lived here, on and off, since I was 12, and the most exciting thing I can remember is a house on fire," she argued, still possessed of an uneasy feeling that he was making fun of her. "Then you'll really appreciate the rough stuff when it does begin," murmured Simon cheerfully, and swung his stick, whistling. They reached the manor. It was not an imposing building, but it had a homely air, and the girl held out her hand. "Won't you come in?" The saint was no laggard. "I'd love to." She took him into a sombre but airy drawing-room, finely furnished, but the saint was never self-conscious. The contrast of his rough, serviceable clothes with the delicate brocaded upholstery did not impress him, and he accepted a seat without any appearance of doubting its ability to support his weight. "May I fetch my aunt?" asked Miss Home. "I know she'd like to meet you." "But of course," assented the saint, smiling, and she was left with a sneaking suspicion that he was agreeing with her second sentence as much as with her first. Miss Girton arrived in a few moments, and Simon knew at once that Bacum had not exaggerated her grimness. "A Nora," Orris had reported, and the saint felt inclined to agree. Miss Girton was stocky, and, as broad as a man, he was surprised at the strength of her grip when she shook hands with him. Her face was weather-beaten. She wore a shirt and tie, and a coarse tweed skirt, woolen stockings, and heavy flat-heeled shoes. Her hair was cropped. "I was wondering when I should meet you," she said immediately. "You must come to dinner and meet some people. I'm afraid the company's very limited here." "I'm afraid I'm prepared for very little company," said Templar. "I'd decided to forget dress clothes for a while." "Lunch, then. Would you like to stay today?" "May I be excused?" "Don't think me uncivil, but I promised my man I'd be back for lunch." "If I don't turn up," explained the saint ingenuously, "Orris would think something had happened to me, and he'd go cruising round with his revolver, and somebody might get hurt." There was an awkward hiatus in the conversation at that point, but it was confined to two of the party, for Templar was admiring a fine specimen of Venetian glass, and did not seem to realize that he had said anything unusual. The girl hastened into the breach. "Mr. Templar has come here for adventure," she said, and Miss Girton stared. "Well, I wish him luck," she said shortly. "On Friday, then, Mr. Templar? I'll ask some people." "Delighted," murmured the saint, bowing, and now there was something faintly mocking about his smile. "On the whole, I don't see why the social amenities shouldn't be observed, even in a vendetta." Miss Girton excused herself soon after, and the saint smoked a cigarette and chatted lightly and easily with Patricia Home. He was an entertaining talker, and he did not introduce any more dark and horrific allusions into his remarks. Nevertheless, he caught the girl looking at him from time to time with a kind of mixture of perplexity, apprehension, and interest, and was hugely delighted. At last he rose to go, and she accompanied him to the gate. "You seem quite sane," she said bluntly as they went down the path. "What was the idea of talking all that rot?" He looked down at her, his eyes dancing. "All my life," he replied, "I have told the truth. It is a great advantage, because if you do that, nobody ever takes you seriously. But talking about murders and revolvers?" "Perhaps," said the saint with that mocking smile, "it will increase the prominence of the part which I hope to play in your thoughts from now onwards, if I tell you that from this morning the most strenuous efforts will be made to kill me." On the other hand, of course, I shall not be killed, so you mustn't worry too much about me. I mean, don't go off your feed or lie awake all night or anything like that." "I'll try not to," she said lightly. "You don't believe me," accused Templar sternly. She hesitated. "Well, one day," said the saint severely, "you will apologize for your unbelief." He gave her a stiff bow and marched away so abruptly that she gasped. It was exactly 1 o'clock when he arrived home at the pillbox, and Horace was flustered and disapproving. "If you hadn't been unpunctual," said Horace, "I'd have been out looking for your corpse. It ain't fair to give a man such a lot of worry. Yeah, so careless I wonder the tiger hasn't put you out half a dozen times." "I've met the most wonderful girl in the world," said Simon impenitently. "By all the laws of adventure, I'm bound to have to save her life 2 or 3 times during the next 10 days. I shall kiss her very passionately in the last chapter. We shall be married." Horace snorted. "Lunch na for minute," he said, and disappeared. The saint washed his hands and ran a comb through his hair in the half-minute's grace, allowed him, and the saint was thoughtful. He had his full measure of human vanity, and it tickled his sense of humour to enter the lists with the air of a mystery man straight out of a detective story. But he had a solid reason for giving his caprice its head. It struck him that the tiger knew all about him and his quest, and that therefore no useful purpose would be served by trying to pretend innocence, whereas a shameless bravado might well bother the other side considerably. They would be racking their brains to find some reason for his brazen front, and crediting him with the most complicated subtleties, when all the time there was nothing behind it but the fact that one pose was as good as another, and the opportunity to play the swashbuckler was too good to be missed. The saint was whistling blithely when Horace brought lunch. He knew that the tiger was in Bacum. He had come halfway across the world to rob the tiger of $1 million, and the jewel promised to be exhilarating as anything in the saint's hell for leather past. Chapter 2. The Naturalist. Algernon de Breton Lomas, Coper, was one of the genial Algis made famous by Mr. P.G. Wodehouse, and accordingly he often ejaculated, "What? What?" to show that he could hardly believe his own brilliance, but now he ejaculated, "What? What?" to show that he could hardly believe his own ears. "It's perfectly true," said Patricia, "and he's coming to lunch." "Wow!" gasped Algy feebly, and relapsed into open-mouthed amazement. He was one of those men who are little changed by the passage of time. He might have been 25 or 35. Studying him very closely, which few took the trouble to do, one gathered that the latter age was more probably right. He was fair, round-faced, pink and white. "He was quite tame," said Patricia. "In fact, I thought he was awfully nice. But he would keep on talking about the terrifying things that he thought were going to happen. He said people were trying to murder him." "Dementia persecutoria," opined Algy. "What?" The girl shook her head. "He was as sane as anyone I've ever met." "Extensio cruris paranoia," suggested Algy sagely. "What on earth's that?" she asked. "An irresistible desire to pull legs." Patricia frowned. "You'll be thinking I'm crazy next," she said. "But somehow you can't help believing him. It's as if he were daring you to take him seriously." "Well, if he manages to wake up this backwater, I'll be grateful to him," said the man. "Are you going to invite me to stay and meet the ogre?" He stayed. Towards 1 o'clock, Patricia sighted Templar coming up the road and went out to meet him at the gate. He was dressed as he had been the day before, but he had fastened his collar and put on a tie. He greeted her with a smile. "Still alive, you see," he remarked. "The ungodly prowled around last night, but I poured a bucket of water over him and he went home." It's astonishing how easy it is to damp the ardour of an assassin. "Isn't that getting a bit stale?" she protested, although she was annoyed to find that the reproof she forced into her tone lacked conviction. "I'm surprised you should say that," he returned gravely. "Personally, I'm only just beginning to appreciate the true succulence of the jest. At least, I hope you won't upset everybody at lunch," she said, and his eyes twinkled. "I'll try to behave," he promised. "At any other time it would have been a fearful effort, but today I'm on my party manners." There were cocktails in the drawing-room. Bacum society prided itself on being up-to-date, and there Algy was brought forward and introduced. "Delighted, long-expected pleasure. What?" he babbled. "Is it really?" asked the saint guilelessly. Algy screwed a pane of glass into his eye and surveyed the visitor with awe. "So you're the mystery man," he prattled on. "You don't mind being called that? I'm sure you won't. Everybody calls you the mystery man, and I honestly think it suits you most awfully well, don't you know? And fancy taking the pillbox. Isn't it too frightfully draughty? But of course you're one of these strong, hearty he-men we see in the pictures." "Algy, you're being rude," interrupted the girl. "Am I really? Only meant for good fellowship and all that sort of thing." "What? What? No offence, old banana pip, you know, don't you know?" "Do I? Don't I?" asked the saint, blinking. The girl rushed into the pause, for she already had a good estimate of the saint's perverse sense of fun, and dreaded its irresponsibility. She felt that at any moment he would produce a revolver and ask if they knew anyone worth murdering. "Algy, be an angel and go and tell Aunt Agatha to hurry up." "That is Mynheer Hans Bloem's nephew," observed the saint calmly as the door closed behind the talkative one. "He is 34. He lived for some years in America. In the city of London he is known as a man with mining property in Transvaal." Patricia was astonished. "You know more about him than I do," she said. "I make it my business to pry into my neighbour's affairs," he answered solemnly. "It mayn't be courteous, but it's cautious. Perhaps you know all about me." She was tempted to challenge him. He turned on her a clear blue eye, which held a mocking gleam. "Only the unimportant things. That you were educated at Mayfield. That Miss Girton isn't your aunt, but a very distant cousin. That you've led a very quiet life, and travelled very little. You're dependent on Miss Girton, because she has the administration of your property until you're 25. That is, for another 5 years. Are you aware," she demanded dangerously, "that you're most impertinent?" He nodded. "Quite unpardonably," he admitted. "I can only plead in excuse that when there's a price on one's head one can't be too particular about one's acquaintances." And he looked meditatively at the yellow-golden contents of his glass, which he had held untasted since it was given him. "Your health," he wished her, and, as he set down the empty glass, he smiled and added, "At least I've no fear of you." She had no time to find an adequate answer before Algy returned with Miss Girton and a tall, thin, leather-faced man who was introduced as Mr. Bloom. "Pleased to meet you," murmured the saint. "So sorry T.T. Deeps are going badly in the market, but this is just the time to make your corner." Bloom started, and his spectacles fell off and dangled at the length of their black-watered ribbon as the boa stared blankly at Simon Templar. "You must be very much on the inside in the city, Mr. Templar," said Bloom. "Extraordinary, isn't it?" agreed Simon with his most saintly smile. Then he was being introduced to a new arrival, Sir Michael Lapping. The ex-judge shook hands heartily, peering short-sightedly into the saint's face. "You remind me of a man I once met in the Old Bailey, and I'm hanged if I can remember whether it was a professional encounter or not." "I was just going to," said the saint blandly, if a trifle cryptically. "His name was Harry the Duke, and you gave him 7 years. He escaped abroad 6 years ago, but I hear he's been back in England some months. Be careful how you go out after dark." It should have fallen to the saint to take Miss Girton into lunch, but his hostess passed him on to Patricia, and the girl was thus able to get a word with him aside. "You've already broken your promise twice," she said. "Do you have to go on like this?" "I'm merely attracting attention," he said. "Having now become the centre of interest, I shall rest on my laurels." He was as good as his word, but Patricia was unreasonably irritated to observe that he had succeeded in attaining his shamelessly confessed object. The others of the party felt vaguely at a disadvantage, and favoured the saint with furtive glances in which was betrayed not a little superstitious awe. Once the saint caught Patricia's eye, and the silent mirth that was always bubbling up behind his eyes spread for a moment into an open grin. She frowned and tossed her pretty head, and entered upon an earnest discussion with Lapping. But when she stole a look at the saint to see how he had taken the snub, she saw that beneath his dutifully decorous demeanour he was shaking with silent laughter, and she was furious. The saint had travelled. He talked interestingly, if with a strong egotistical bias about places as far removed from civilization and from each other as Vladivostok, Armenia, Moscow, Lapland, Chungking, Pernambuco, and Sierra Leone. There seemed to be few of the wilder parts of the world which he had not visited, and few of those in which he had not had adventures. He had won a gold rush in South Africa and lost his holding in a poker game 24 hours later. He had run guns into China, whiskey into the United States, and perfume into England. He had deserted after a year in the Spanish Foreign Legion. He had worked his passage across the Atlantic as a steward, tramped across America, fought his way across Mexico during a free-for-all revolution, picked up a couple of £1,000 in the Argentine, and sailed home from Buenos Aires in a millionaire's suite to lose nearly all the fruit of his wanderings on Epsom Downs. "You'll find Bacum very dull after such an exciting life," said Miss Girton. "Somehow I don't agree," said the saint. "I find the air very bracing." Bloom adjusted his spectacles and inquired, "And what might your employment be at the moment?" "Just now," said the saint suavely, "I'm looking for $1 million. I feel that I should like to end my days in luxury, and I can't get along on less than 15,000 a year." Algy squawked with merriment. "Haw, haw," he yapped. "Jolly good. Too awfully horribly priceless." "What? What?" "Quite," the saint concurred modestly. "I fear," said Lapping, "that you will hardly find your $1 million in Bacum." The saint put his hands on the tablecloth and studied his fingernails with a gentle smile. "You depress me, Sir Michael," he remarked. And I was feeling very optimistic. I was told that there were $1 million to be picked up here, and one can hardly disbelieve the word of a dying man, especially when one has tried to save his life. It was at a place called Ayah Pahit in the Malay States. He'd taken to the jungle. They'd hunted him through every town in the peninsula, ever since they located him settling down in Singapore to enjoy an unjust share of the loot, and one of their Malay trackers had caught him and stuck a kriss in him. I found him just before he passed out, and he told me most of the story. But I'm boring you." "Not a bit, dear old sprout, not a bit," rejoined Algy eagerly, and he was supported by a chorus of curiosity. The saint shook his head. "But I'm quite certain I shall bore you if I go on," he stated obstinately. "Now suppose I'd been talking about Brazil. Did you know there was a village behind an almost impassable range of hills covered with thick, poisonous jungle where some descendants of Cortez's crowd still live? They're gradually being absorbed into the native stock, Mayas, by intermarriage, but they still wear swords and talk good Castilian. They could hardly believe my rifle. I remember. And it was impossible to wheedle him back to any further discussion of his $1 million. He made his excuses as soon after coffee as was decently possible, and spoke last to Patricia. "When you get to know me better, as you must, you'll learn to forgive my weakness. I suppose it's nothing but a silly desire to cause a sensation," she said coldly. "Nothing but that," said the saint with disarming frankness, and went home with a comfortable feeling that he had had the better of the exchange. In spite of the protestations of Horace, he took a walk during the afternoon. He wanted to be familiar with the territory for some distance around, and thus his route took him inland towards the uplands which sheltered the village on the south. It was the first time he had surveyed the ground, but his hunting experience had given him a good eye for country, and at the end of 3 hours' hard tramping he had every detail of the district mapped in his brain. It was on the homeward hike that he met the stranger. His walk had been as solitary as a walk in North Devon can be. He had not even encountered any farm labourers, for the land for miles around was unclaimed moor. But this man was so obviously harmless, even at a distance of half a mile, that the saint frowned thoughtfully. The man was in +4s of a dazzling purple hue. He had a kind of haversack slung over his shoulder, and he carried a butterfly net. He moved aimlessly about, sometimes in short, violent rushes, sometimes walking, sometimes crawling, and rooting about on his hands and knees. He did not seem to notice Templar at all, and the saint, moving very silently, came right up and stood over him during an exceptionally zealous burrowing exploration among some gorse bushes. While Simon watched, the naturalist made a sudden pounce, accompanied by a gasp of triumph, and wriggled back into the open with a small beetle held gingerly between his thumb and forefinger. The haversack was hitched round, a matchbox secured, the insect imprisoned therein, and the box carefully stowed away. Then the entomologist rose to his feet, perspiring and very red in the face. "Good afternoon, sir," he remarked genially, mopping his brow with an appallingly green silk handkerchief. "So it is," agreed the saint. Mr. Templar had a disconcerting trick of taking the most conventional speech quite literally, a device which he had adopted because it threw the onus of continuing the conversation upon the other party. An innocuous and healthy pastime, explained the stranger, with a friendly and all-embracing sweep of his hand. Fresh air exercise, and all in the most glorious scenery in England. He was half a head shorter than the saint, but a good 2 stone heavier. His eyes were large and childlike behind a pair of enormous horn-rimmed glasses, and he wore a straggly pale walrus moustache. The sight of this big middle-aged man in the shocking clothes, with his ridiculous little butterfly net, was as diverting as anything the saint could remember. "Of course you're Dr. Khan," said the saint, and the other started. "How did you know? I always seem to be giving people surprises," complained Simon, completely at his ease. "It's so simple. You look less like a doctor than anyone but a doctor could look, and there's only one doctor in Bacum. How's trade?" Suddenly Khan was no longer genial. "My profession?" he said stiffly. "I don't quite understand." "You are one of many," sighed the saint. "Nobody ever quite understands me. And I wasn't talking about your new profession, but about your old trade." Khan looked very closely at the younger man, but Simon was gazing at the sea, and his face was inscrutable, except for a faintly mocking twist at the corners of his mouth, a twist that might have meant anything. "You're clever, Templar, Mr. Templar to the aristocracy, but saint to you," Simon corrected him benevolently. "Naturally I'm clever. If I wasn't, I'd be dead. And my especial brilliance is an infallible memory for faces. You're clever, Templar, but this time you're mistaken, and persisting in your delusion is making you forget your manners." The saint favoured Khan with a lazy smile. "Well, well," he murmured. "To is human, is not it? But tell me, Dr. Khan, why you allow an automatic pistol to spoil the set of that beautiful coat? Are you afraid of a scarabaeus turning at bay? Or is it that you're scared of a great white woolly wooga-wooga jumping out of a bush?" And the saint swung his heavy staff as though weighing its efficiency as a bludgeon, and the clear blue eyes with that lively devil of mischief glimmering in their depths never left Khan's red face. Khan glared back chokingly. "Sir," he exploded at length, "let me tell you. I, too, was once an inspector of horse marines to the Swiss Navy," the saint encouraged him gently, and when Khan's indignation proved to have become speechless, he added, "But why am I so unsociable? Come along to the pillbox and have a spot of supper." "I'm afraid it'll only be tin stuff. We stopped having fresh meat since a seagull died after tasting the Sunday joint, but our brandy is Napoleon, and Oris grills sardines marvellously." He linked his arm in Khan's and urged the naturalist along, chattering irrepressibly. It is an almost incredible tribute to the charm which the saint could exert, to record that he coaxed Khan into acceptance in 3 minutes, and had him chuckling at a grossly improper limerick by the time they reached the pillbox. "You're a card, Templar," said Khan as they sat over martinis in the sitting-room, and the saint raised indulgent eyebrows. "Because I called your bluff? Because you didn't hesitate." "He who hesitates," said the saint sententiously, "is bossed. No mughopper will ever spiel this baby." They talked politics and literature through supper. The saint had original and heretical views on both subjects, as dispassionately as the most ordinary men, met together in the most ordinary circumstances, might have done. After Horace had served coffee and withdrawn, Khan produced a cigar case and offered it to the saint. Templar looked, and shook his head with a smile. "Not even with you, dear heart," he said, and Khan was aggrieved. "There's nothing wrong with them." "I'm so glad you haven't wasted a cigar, then. If I give you my word." "I'll take it, but I won't take your cigars." Khan shrugged, took one himself and lighted it. The saint settled himself more comfortably in his armchair. "I'm glad to see you don't pack a gun yourself," observed the doctor presently. "It makes one so unpopular, letting off artillery and things all over Devonshire," said Simon. "You can only do that in shockers. In real life, the police make all sorts of awkward inquiries if you go slaughtering people here and there because they look cockeyed at you. But I don't advise anyone to bank on my consideration for the nerves of the neighbourhood when I'm in my own home." Khan sat forward abruptly. "We've bluffed for an hour and a half by the clock," he said. "Suppose we get down to brass tacks." "I'll suppose anything you like," assented Simon. "I know you've got some funny game on, and I know you aren't one of those dude detectives, because I've made inquiries. You aren't even Secret Service. I know something about your record, And I gather you haven't come to Bacum because you got an idea you'd like to vegetate in rural England and grow string beans. You aren't the sort that goes anywhere unless they can see easy money or big trouble waiting for collection. I might have decided to quit before I stopped something. You might, but your sort doesn't quit while there's a kick left in 'em. Besides, what do you think I've been doing all the time I've been down here? Hunting the elusive wooga-wooga, presumably, drawled the saint. Khan made a gesture of impatience. I've told you you're clever, he said, and I meant every letter of it, in capital italics. But you don't have to pretend you think I'm a fool, because I know you know better. You're here for what you can get, and I've a good idea what that is. If I'm right, it's my job to get in your way all I can, unless you work in with me. Templar, I'm paying you the compliment of putting the cards on the table, because from what I hear I'd rather work with you than against you. Now, why can't you come across? The saint had sunk deeper into his armchair. The room was lighted only by the smoky oil lamp that Oris had brought in with the coffee, for the sky had clouded over in the late afternoon, and night had come on early. There are just 1,000,000 reasons why I shouldn't come across, said the saint tranquilly. They were lost to the Confederated Bank of Chicago quite a time ago, and I want them all to myself, my good Khan. You don't imagine you could get away with it? I can think of no limits to my ingenuity in getting away with things, said the saint calmly. He moved in the shadows, and a moment later he said quietly, There is 1,000,001st argument which prevents me coming across just now, Khan, and that is that I never allow tiger cubs to listen in on my confessions. What do you mean? Asked Khan. I mean, said the saint in a clear, strong voice, that at this moment there's some son of a gun peeking through that embrasure. I've got him covered, and if he so much as blinks, I'm going to shoot his eyelids off.